The Miller family's farm was just a few hours away from New York, in a small, quiet village where people knew each other by name, and sunsets reflected in a field of corn as if drowning in a sea of golden waves. This place seemed ideal for those who were tired of the hustle and bustle of the big city and longed for tranquility. However, behind this calmness was a story that few people dared to talk about. David Miller inherited the farm from his father, who was once a respected man in the area. But the last years of the elder Miller's life were shrouded in oddities. People said that he stopped communicating with his neighbors, and at night you could hear the sound of a hammer and the creak of heavy footsteps on the farm. David often saw his father standing in the distance at the edge of the field, as if he was watching something invisible that no one but him could see. When his father died, the farm went to David and his family, his wife Lauren, and 2 children. David was sure that he would be able to bring the farm back to life by investing his soul and strength. The first months of work did not bear much fruit, but there were also oddities that began almost immediately. Lauren was the first to notice the footprints. At first they were barely visible among the tall grass behind the house, long, with vague outlines, as if someone was dragging something heavy behind them. Later, they began to appear at the veranda itself, and one morning, the tracks led directly to the bedroom window where their children were sleeping. David blamed it on wild animals that could roam at night in search of food, and tried not to scare the family. However, a couple of weeks later, they were woken up at night by a heavy crash, as if something massive had fallen into the attic. David grabbed a flashlight and went upstairs, trying not to betray his own fear. The attic was empty, but there were deep scratches on the old wooden floor, as if someone had dragged claws over it with effort. The following nights brought more and more fears. The sounds grew louder, and the doors in the barn behind the house, which were always locked, turned out to be wide open in the morning. Lauren began to notice that their eldest son, Tommy, often woke up in the night and looked out the window with an expression as if something was moving there. But every time she went to the window, all she saw was a calm field illuminated by moonlight. One day, David decided to put cameras around the perimeter of the house. David installed the cameras with extreme care. He spent several hours making sure that all the devices were working properly and covering every corner of the farm. At night, when the family fell into an anxious sleep, the cameras began their first shift. David checked the records first thing in the morning. For the first few hours, nothing attracted attention. A calm night field, lazily swaying tree branches. But around 3 in the morning, one of the cameras recorded a faint movement near the barn. A figure dressed in dark clothes moved with silent grace along the wall, looking around. David clenched his fists, realizing that someone had broken into their farm. He called the sheriff, and an hour later a patrol car was parked outside the house. Sheriff Hopkins, a burly man with short-cropped hair, examined the notes with a frown. He advised David and his family to be extra careful and promised to strengthen night patrols. The next day in the evening, David decided to check the territory again. He walked around the entire site, examining every corner. Near the barn, he found the remains of a shoe stuck between the boards. The shoe was old, with cracked leather and traces of dirt, as if its owner had walked through fields and forests for a long time. Lauren, upon learning about this, began to panic. She insisted that the children sleep in their room, and the doors and windows were locked. There was a tense silence in the house, broken only by the sounds of nocturnal animals outside the window. The next night, the noises resumed, but this time they were closer. Thuds resounded right against the wall of their house, as if someone was trying to break in. David, grabbing the shotgun that was stored under the bed, cautiously went to the door and looked out the window. Nothing, just twinkling lights in the distance and a waving field. But when he turned to the stairs, he noticed that the attic door was slightly ajar. David's heart began to beat faster, and he felt a cold sweat run down his back. Something was wrong. He remembered that he had closed this door when he went up to the attic, and now it was ajar, as if someone had decided to look inside. David walked slowly to the stairs, trying not to make a sound. Each step echoed in the silence like a hammer striking metal. As he climbed the steps, he listened to the sounds around him, but all he could hear was his own breathing and the cracking of old wooden planks. When he reached the top landing, darkness enveloped him. Barely able to make out something in the dimness, David reached for the light switch. The light turned on with a sharp click, and he instantly turned around, expecting to see someone who could open the door. But the attic was empty, except for old boxes and covered with dust. David took a flashlight and illuminated the dark corners. Suddenly, his gaze fell on an old chest in the corner. He had never paid attention to it, but now something about it attracted him. The chest was sealed, but there were several old tools lying around it, some of which looked like items his father might have used. David bent down to take a closer look at the chest and noticed that it was slightly ajar. Gathering his courage, David opened it. Inside was a dusty old book. Its cover was made of worn leather. David carefully removed the book, and the dust rose into the air, making him sneeze. The pages were yellowed and some of them were torn. He started flipping through the book, and the notes caught his attention. They were his father's notes, but they looked strange. They were not written in the usual style, but with incoherent, disturbing phrases. Shadows should not see the light. He comes for us at night. We must be ready. These recordings made David feel a chill of fear. What was going on with his father? While he was reading, he heard a noise downstairs. It was as if something had fallen to the floor, and then there were muffled footsteps, as if someone had broken into the house. David put the book in the trunk and hurried downstairs, holding the shotgun at the ready. When he got to the kitchen, Lauren and the kids were panicking. "What's going on?" Lauren asked fearfully, her eyes filled with horror. "I heard someone walking around the house." David nodded, trying to calm her down. "It looks like someone is really trying to get into the house," he said, examining every shadow in the corners. His feet seemed rooted to the floor. Fear gripped him, but he knew that he could not leave his family defenseless. "Lauren, take the kids to the bedroom and lock the doors," he ordered, feeling the growing tension in the air begin to press on his chest. Lauren rushed to follow his instructions, and David, unable to stay in place, went out onto the veranda to look around. The night was dark and ominous, and the wind stirred the grass, making strange noises as if nature itself was whispering about something terrible. Suddenly, he saw a figure at the edge of the field, the same one he had seen on the recording. She stood as still as a statue, looking at the house. "Hey!" David shouted, but the figure did not respond. She just kept standing there as if watching him. His heart was pounding. He raised the shotgun to his shoulder and shouted again, "Who's there?" But instead of answering, the figure took a step forward. David, overcome with fear, took aim, but at the moment when he was about to shoot, the figure suddenly disappeared into the shadows, as if it had disappeared into thin air. David lowered the shotgun in disbelief. He knew he couldn't afford to give up. "We need to find out who it is and what's going on at the farm. But first of all, you need to protect your family." Returning to the house, he locked all the doors and windows and then went to the bedroom where Lauren and the children were hiding under blankets. He looked at their faces, full of fear and misunderstanding. David felt he had to find the answer to this riddle, otherwise the fear would never leave their house. Descending the stairs, he found himself in a hallway where the darkness seemed more palpable than ever. He pushed open the door to the bedroom, where Lauren and the children were still sleeping, but with concern on their faces. He lay down on his bed, still thinking about what had happened. However, David couldn't sleep. The fear did not leave him. He decided he had to figure out what was going on. In the morning, he called Sheriff Hopkins, who came to the farm with one of his deputies to investigate the situation. The sheriff was an experienced man, but after seeing the concern on David's face, he still agreed to help. "Let's check out the barn," the sheriff suggested as he and David approached him. "We'll find out what's going on there." When they entered the barn, Sheriff Hopkins began to inspect the area, paying attention to every small object. David followed him, trying not to miss a single detail. Suddenly, the sheriff stopped and pointed at the wall. "Look," he said, squatting down. "This is something strange." There were strange signs on the wall of the barn, as if someone had made them with claws. They formed complex patterns resembling ancient symbols. David looked closer and felt that these signs were familiar to him. His father often drew similar symbols in his notes. "I saw something like that in a book," David said softly, remembering the old book in the attic. It was written there. The sheriff looked at him, and David felt fear begin to overwhelm him. "We have to find out," Hopkins said. "If this is really something dangerous, we need to understand what we are dealing with." They left the barn, and when David returned to the house, he remembered the book. He went up to the attic again, but now with Hopkins following him. When they reached the attic, David rushed to the chest, but when he opened it, he found that the book was missing again. "She's gone!" David exclaimed, confused and scared. "What exactly are you looking for?" the sheriff asked, trying to figure out what was going on. "The book. She was here," David explained. "It contained my father's notes about what was going on at the farm. It's like a warning." The sheriff frowned and looked around. Suddenly, they both heard a dull sound, as if something had hit the floor below. "We're not alone," Hopkins said, and his voice became firm as they quickly descended to the ground floor. In the hall, they saw that the doors leading to the basement were ajar. David felt his heart begin to pound. This was the basement his father had always told him not to go down there. "We have to check it out," the sheriff said, his face serious. David nodded, although a feeling of unease was rising inside him. They went down the stairs to the basement, and as soon as they were at the bottom, darkness enveloped them. The walls were damp, and the air was filled with a musty smell. Hopkins turned on the flashlight, illuminating the space, and they saw racks of boxes and old objects covered with a layer of dust. But there were the same signs on the basement wall as in the barn, and they were everywhere, creating a terrible pattern. "This is really weird," the sheriff whispered, moving closer to the wall. "I've never seen anything like it." David felt his body tighten with fear. He knew he had to leave, but his leg wouldn't move. Suddenly, he noticed that there was another book on the floor. He bent down and picked it up, and when he opened it, his heart beat even faster. It was the book he was looking for, with his father's notes. "We can't stay here," Hopkins said, but at that moment, something started happening. Suddenly, the light of the lantern twitched, and then went out. Darkness filled the basement, and they both froze. There were soft rustles and muffled sounds in the air, as if someone was nearby. David quickly turned on his flashlight, but only for a moment saw figures rushing past. "Quickly," the sheriff shouted. They both rushed to the stairs, but it was already too late. The door leading to the basement slammed, and they were locked inside. David felt panic creep over him. He started banging on the door, but it wouldn't budge. Then a sound like breathing came from the darkness, and shadows were approaching them. He turned to Hopkins, and they both realized they had to act before it was too late. "We need to find a way out," David said, panicked and afraid. They began to search the perimeter, lighting up every corner. The situation was becoming more and more desperate, and every second seemed like an eternity. Suddenly, David's flashlight illuminated a small crack in the wall leading to another corridor. "This way," he shouted, and they both rushed to the gap, feeling something approaching behind them. As they climbed through the narrow passage, they felt the shadows glide by, and their fear became unbearable. Finally, having got out of the passage, they found themselves in another room, which fortunately was illuminated. It was an old room full of abandoned things. David and Hopkins turned around and realized that this was not just a basement. There were tools, old furniture, and a lot of paintings depicting strange scenes, terrible images, distorted faces, and dark silhouettes. This is not normal," Hopkins said, his voice trembling with fear. David felt something tighten in his chest. Everything that had happened in their lives was now becoming clear. His father knew about something that killed him. "We have to get out of here," he said, and they started looking for a way out, but immediately heard rustling and knocking. Suddenly, as if out of nowhere, the figure appeared in the room again, and they both froze in fear. "Please leave," the figure said. It was a woman with disheveled hair and an expression of utter horror on her face. "Who are you?" David asked, even though his heart was about to burst out of his chest. "I'm not here by accident," she said, her voice trembling. "I know what's going on." "You need to leave. This is the place. It's waiting." At that moment, the wall behind them began to crack, and David realized that they had to act. "We can't stay here," he said, taking Hopkins by the hand. "Let's find a way out." They rushed to the other side of the room, where there was another passage. The figure tried to stop them, but they couldn't afford to slow down. At that moment, there was a loud crack, and the wall began to collapse. As they ran, everything around them began to change. Furniture was falling, and the light was flickering. David could feel the fear creeping over him. They ran out into the corridor, but it wasn't the same corridor they had seen earlier. There were doors everywhere, but none opened. "Where should we go?" Hopkins shouted, his voice sounding like a scream in the void. "There must be a way out," David replied, his mind working at the limit. He knew he had to find that woman. She might know how to get out. "It's here," she said suddenly, appearing next to him. "Follow me." They followed her, making their way through the corridors, and soon found themselves at the door. It was old, made of dark wood, and looked like it could lead them to freedom. The woman opened it, and a bright light opened in front of them, as if they had come out of a dark nightmare. "Go ahead," she screamed, and they rushed into the light. When they ran out, they found themselves outside, in a field where the sun was shining and silence enveloped them. David and Hopkins stood, taking a deep breath, and the woman looked at them with sadness in her eyes. "It's not over yet," she said. "They're still waiting." David looked at her, but she was already disappearing into thin air. "Wait for what?" he said, but she just shook her head, as if she understood that they had to figure it out on their own. When they returned to the house, David felt it was time to act. He must find out the truth about his father and what happened on the farm. And even though his family was safe, he knew that this story was just beginning. There was a fire burning inside him, and he wasn't going to give up until he revealed the secrets that rested on this earth. He looked at Hopkins, and there was determination in their eyes. They knew that it was necessary to find out the truth, and no matter how difficult it was, they could not leave this case unfinished. "We have to go back inside," David said, and they went inside again. Death and fear were his constant companions, but he wasn't going to let those feelings break him. Now he knew that his father might have left clues in the notes, and he had to find them to complete the story.